The Puranas describe a universe shaped like an egg, vertically divided into the celestial worlds, earth, and nether worlds. The earth is a disk, consisting of 7 land masses, varshas, arranged in concentric circles, alternating with seas of salt water, molasses, wine, butter, curd, milk, and fresh water. Situated in the center of the earth is Jambudvipa, in whose southernmost part lies Bharatavarsha, the golden Meru mountain rising from its midst. One of several explanations of the name Bharatavarsha connects it with the Bharata people, descendants of the legendary king Bharata, son of Dushyantha and Shakuntala. Cosmography blends with geography in the Puranas. Bharatavarsha is said to consist of 9 divisions, khandas, separated from one another by seas. But the mention of its mountains, rivers, and places, some of which can be identified, suggests that the composers of such texts were familiar with various areas of the Indian subcontinent, and perceived them as parts of a larger cultural whole. For people of other lands, the major subcontinental landmark was the Indus, or Sindhu, the mighty river that originates in the Deccan Plateau, owing 3,200 kilometers southwest across fertile plains before it merges with the Arabian Sea. The words India, Hindu, and Hindustan originate from the name of this river. Ancient Chinese sources refer to the land of Shentu, Greek texts mention India, and Persian inscriptions describe Hiju as one of the subject countries of the Achaemenid king Darius. These terms initially referred only to the lower Indus Valley, but their connotations expanded swiftly. For Megasthenes, who visited the court of Chandragupta Maurya in the 4th century BCE, India meant the entire subcontinent. Many centuries later, Arabic and Persian texts used the word Hindustan for this vast stretch of land and Hindu for its inhabitants. While the idea of the Indian subcontinent forming a distinct geographic and cultural unit is a very old one, its nation-states India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka emerged only in recent times. When exploring the ancient history of South Asia, it is necessary to ignore modern political boundaries and to treat the Indian subcontinent and its many regions and sub-regions as a single canvas. The history of the subcontinent is really about the historical trajectories and interactions of these regions and sub-regions, which at certain points of time during the peak of the Maurya, Mughal, and British empires attained some measure of political unity. The main physiographic zones of the subcontinent. The Indian subcontinent has fairly well-defined geographical frontiers but enormous ecological diversity. Its climatic patterns are similar to those prevailing in other areas on the same latitude but are significantly modified by the Himalayas and the Western Ghats. The Himalayas block the icy northern winds from sweeping across the Indo-Gangetic plains in winter as well as the rain-laden monsoon winds from the southwest in summer. The barrier of the Western Ghats similarly leads to rainfall in the western coastal strip. Most of the subcontinent gets its rains from the southwest monsoon, except for the northwest and Sri Lanka, which rely on winter rains. In the north, the subcontinent is bordered by the Himalayas, fairly young fold mountains. The process of their uplift and folding is still going on, making them geologically unstable. The Himalayas can be divided into the western, central, and eastern zones, each with their own specific characteristics. The northwestern part of the subcontinent includes the arid mountainous northwest frontier province and the Baluchistan province of contemporary Pakistan. Leaving aside the fertile river valleys, this area is not especially suited for agriculture, but the many routes running along its valleys and passes connect the subcontinent with areas lying to its west. Even more arid conditions prevail in the Thar Desert of Rajasthan, where low hills and sand dunes rise over the underlying low, rocky plateau. Between the desert and the northwestern mountains lies the Sindh province of southern Pakistan, the Indus providing precious water in an area of very low rainfall. The northern course of this river lies in Tibet and Ladakh, and along with its tributaries, it ows through the fertile plains of Indian and Pakistani Punjab. To the east of the Indus is the shriveled course of a once mighty river, the Ghaggar Hakra. The fertile northern alluvial plain of the Ganga and its tributaries is another major geographical zone of the subcontinent. The western part of this plain is known as the Dub, literally, the land between two rivers, the Ganga and Yamuna. The mid-DLE part of the plains corresponds roughly to the state of Bihar and the eastern part of the state of Uttar Pradesh in modern India. The eastern part includes the delta of the Ganga and Brahmaputra, comprising of modern West Bengal, Assam, and Bangladesh. The Vindhyan ranges separate the northern plains from peninsular India, while the Aravalli hills divide the Thar Desert from central India. The Malva Plateau, with its two major rivers, the Nirmada and Tapi, lies between the Aravallis and the central Indian mountains. Peninsular India is an old and relatively stable geological formation, its landscape marked by plateaus, plains, and the fertile valleys of rivers such as the Mahanadi, Krishna, Godavari, Pennar, and Kaveri. The Deccan Plateau, formed by the lava ouse from very ancient volcanoes, constitutes the dominant part of the peninsula. It is bordered by the eastern and western Ghats, beyond which are the narrow Coromandel and Malabar, Konkan coastal plains. The Nilgiri, Annamalai, and Cardamom hills lie in the extreme south of the peninsula, which is separated from the island of Sri Lanka by the Mannar Strait. The various geographical zones of the subcontinent have never been isolated units. From very early times, human interaction took place through routes cutting across mountains, rivers, and regions, dictated by geographical features and human needs. The Himalayas could be crossed at points such as the Bolan, Gomal, and Khyber passes, and a network of overland routes connected the subcontinent to China, Central Asia, West Asia, and Europe. There was also the over 7,500 kilometers long subcontinental coastline, home to numerous shing and sailing communities from times immemorial, which linked the subcontinent to the larger Indian Ocean world and to areas such as Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf. The natural landscape has always been an important part of human life, and has affected and influenced people's thought and action in many ways. The topography, climate, soil, and natural resources of any land influence modes of subsistence, settlement patterns, population density, and trade. Humans have in turn transformed the environment in many ways. Situating the human past in its specific environmental context helps us understand the different rhythms and patterns of cultural development and interactions in the various regions. However, as we will see further on, ecology too has a history, and the subcontinental environments of today differ in many respects from those of the past. Ways of dividing the Indian past. The English word history comes from the Greek historia, inquiry or investigation. History is essentially a discipline that inquires into the experiences of people who lived in the past. Historians often classify the past by dividing it into different periods. Labels are convenient, but they should be meaningful and consistent, and it is necessary to be aware of their limitations. For a long time, historians divided Indian history into the Hindu, Muslim, and British periods. However, this classification is odd and can be questioned on several grounds. For example, is the religious affiliation of the ruling elite the best basis for labeling a period? In that case, why is the third period described as the British and not the Christian period? From when can we start using the term Hindu in the context of ancient India? How can it be applied to the reigns of the many ancient Indian kings who patronized Buddhism or Jainism? Did the advent of Muslim rulers create a major rupture in the fabric of Indian society, especially when the sway of these rulers except at the height of the Mughal Empire did not extend over all or even most of the subcontinent? Due to such reasons, most historians have discarded the Hindu, Muslim, British periodization of the Indian past in favor of a more neutral classification into the ancient, early medieval, and modern periods. The dividing lines may vary, but the ancient period can be considered as stretching roughly from the earliest times to the 6th century CE, the early medieval from the 6th to the 13th centuries, the medieval from the 13th to the 18th centuries, and the modern from the 18th century to the present. The current use of these terms shifts the focus away from religious labels towards patterns of significant socio-economic changes. The ancient or earliest parts of the human past can be further divided into prehistory and history. The enormously long period before the invention of writing and the study of that period are known as prehistory. The part of the past that comes after the invention of writing, and the study of that part of the past, i.e., of literate societies, constitute what is considered history. A language consists of spoken symbols of communication. A script, or writing, is a system of visual communication using signs or symbols associated with specific meanings or sounds, written down on some surface. Human beings used languages long before they invented scripts. The cuneiform script of Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, was invented in c. 3400 BCE and Egyptian hieroglyphics in c. 3100 BCE. In the Indian subcontinent, the earliest substantial evidence of writing is associated with the Harappan Civilization and dates from c. 2600 BCE, but recent discoveries push back the origins of the script to the second half of the 4th millennium BCE. The ancient Mesopotamians pressed letters onto moist clay tablets, while the ancient Egyptians wrote on papyrus sheets made of reeds. The Harappan script is mostly found on seals and ceilings. But apart from the specimens of writing that have actually survived, it can be assumed that people must have written on perishable material as well. Writing marked a new stage in human expression and communication. It opened new possibilities for storing and transmitting ideas and knowledge across distance and time. Its impact was complex and varied. Rulers used writing to advertise and exercise power, merchants to record business transactions, priests to preserve religious texts, and poets to give permanence to their creative expression. We can speculate about the precise impulses that led to the invention of writing, but all over the world, with a few exceptions, it coincided with the emergence of cities and states. For these reasons, historians consider the beginning of writing an important watershed in the story of ancient cultures. However, in a situation where relatively few people knew how to read or write, writing gave a certain power and privilege to those who knew it and denied it to those who did not. Further, the invention of writing did not mean the end of oral transmission. The spoken word has always held a special significance in many cultural traditions, and this significance continued even after manuscripts of texts came to be made. Oral versions of many written texts continued to circulate and often had a far greater outreach and impact. The beginning of writing is also an important watershed in the study of the past because written evidence becomes available to the historian. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that such evidence covers only a very small portion of the human past. The past before writing, prehistory, and the history of non-literate people who did not leave behind written sources are also extremely important and have to be recovered. And even when written sources are available, archaeological sources continue to be important for historians. In the Indian subcontinent, the story of writing is a bit complicated. Although the Harappans were a literate people, their script has not yet been deciphered. So historians cannot use the written material they left behind to reconstruct their history. Another mystery is, what happened to writing after the decline of the Harappan civilization in c. 1900 BCE? While it is possible that people continued to write, although on perishable material, there are hardly any surviving specimens of writing between c. 1900 BCE till we come to the 4th century BCE. The oldest script in the subcontinent is the Harappan script, but the oldest deciphered script is Brahmi, known from about the 4th century BCE, and the two scripts seem to be quite different. For these reasons, it is not easy to draw the dividing line between history and prehistory in India, and the term proto-history is useful. This word carries different meanings. In the European context, it is sometimes used to refer to people who did not themselves have writing, but who are mentioned in the written records of a contemporary literate group. In the Indian subcontinent, the Harappan civilization, a literate culture with an undeciphered script, is included in proto-history. This term can also include the period c. 1500 to 500 BCE, for which there is an orally transmitted literature, the Vedas, but no evidence of writing. Archaeologists often use the word proto-history for the long period between the beginning of food production and the advent of iron technology. This would include Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures in different parts of the subcontinent. The subcontinent is a huge geographical area, and the transition to literacy did not take place everywhere at the same time. For instance, areas outside the literate Harappan zone were inhabited by non-literate people. Going by the earliest surviving samples of deciphered writing, the beginning of the historical period in North India would have to be placed in the 4th century BCE. However, it can be presumed that this writing had a history on perishable material, one that must go back to at least the 6th century BCE. Lists of historical kings and philosophers of this century are available for parts of North India. Considering all these factors, there is a good case for placing the beginning of the historical period in North India in the 6th century BCE. The evidence of 4th century BCE Brahmi inscriptions from Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, 2nd century BCE Tamil, Brahmi inscriptions, and the political history reacted in Sangam literature suggest that the transition to the historical period in South India occurred sometime between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE. Of course, if the Harappan script is deciphered someday, the dates for the beginning of the historical period in northern India will have to be pushed back to the 3rd millennium BCE, or even earlier. Changing interpretations of early Indian history. The historiography, the scholarly activity of constructing and writing history, of ancient and early medieval India reveals many significant changes over time. These can be understood against the background of the political and intellectual contexts in which they emerged and flourished. The various schools of history writing are often presented and understood in terms of one school making way for the other in a neat, forward progression. The reality is, however, much more complex. There was considerable variety within the various schools, some of them coexisted, and still do so, in dialogue or connivity with each other, and there are many examples of writings that go against the grain and do not easily tee into the dominant historiographical trends of their time. The 18th and 19th centuries were dominated by the writings of European scholars, usually referred to as the Orientalists or Indologists, although they often described themselves as antiquarians. Many of them were employees of the East India Company and later, the British government of India. The founding of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784 provided an institutional focus for scholars working in a number of related fields such as textual study, epigraphy, numismatics, and history. A major contribution of the Indologists lay in their efforts to collect, edit, and translate ancient Indian texts. In this, they depended heavily on information provided by native informants, whose contribution was rarely acknowledged. Indology soon spread beyond the confines of the British Empire and became a subject of study in European universities. Apart from the study of ancient texts, the 19th century also witnessed important developments in the field of epigraphy, numismatics, archaeology, and the study of art and architecture. The decipherment of the Ashokan Brahmi and Kharoshtha scripts were major breakthroughs. The analysis of coins contributed to the construction of a framework of political history. Officers of the Geological Survey discovered prehistoric stone tools and laid the basis of Indian prehistory. The Archaeological Survey of India was established in 1871, and over the succeeding decades, this institution made an important contribution towards unearthing and analyzing the material remains of India's past. The contributions and breakthroughs of the 18th and 19th centuries were rooted in a colonial context, and this is evident in certain features of Indological writing. The Brahminical perspective of ancient Sanskrit texts was often uncritically taken as re-estating the Indian past. Social and religious institutions and traditions were critiqued from a Western viewpoint. Indian society was presented as static and its political systems unwaveringly despotic over the centuries. Race, religion, and ethnicity were often confused with each other, and there was a tendency to exaggerate the impact of foreign influence on ancient India. This is the time when the classification of the Indian past into the Hindu, Muslim, and British periods took root. Indian scholars of the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries made major contributions towards constructing a connected narrative of ancient India. Writing against the background of an emergent, and later increasingly strong, national movement, these historians are generally referred to as nationalist historians. They were responsible for meticulously weaving together data from texts, inscriptions, coins, and other material remains to amplify the contours of the ancient Indian past. Especially important contributions were made in the field of political history. South India was brought into the narrative and the study of regional polities progressed. The nationalist tinge in the writings of these scholars can be seen in their insistence on the indigenous roots of all major cultural developments. It is also reacted in their search for golden ages, which led to their exalting the age of the Vedas and the Gupta Empire. Non-monarchical polities were discovered and were celebrated to counter the idea that India had never known anything but despotic rule. The periodization of the Indian past into the Hindu, Muslim, and British periods was, however, retained. It coalesced with a communal tendency to valorize the Hindu period and to project the advent of the Turks and Islam as a calamity and tragedy. The 1950s saw the emergence of Marxist historiography, which went on to play an extremely influential role in the construction of the history of ancient and early medieval India. In the long run, the major achievement of Marxist historians was to shift the focus from an event-centered history dominated by political narrative to the delineation of social and economic structures and processes, especially those related to class stratification and agrarian relations. Marxist historiography also contributed towards uncovering the history of non-elite groups, some of whom had suffered centuries of subordination and marginalization. While making these valuable interventions and contributions, Marxist writings often tended to work with unilinear historical models derived from Western historical and anthropological writings. Texts were sometimes read uncritically, with insufficient attention paid to their problematic chronology and peculiarities of genre. Archaeological data was included, but the basic framework of the historical narrative remained text-centric. Initially, the focus on class meant less attention to other bases of social stratification such as caste and gender. Religion and culture were often sidelined or mechanically presented as reactions of socio-economic structures. Despite their important differences, the major historiographical schools also shared some similarities, for instance, in their emphasis on Brahminical Sanskrit texts and their tendency to marginalize archaeological evidence. Certain tenets of all these schools continue to thrive in the present. Some of the fundamental premises and methods of Orientalist historiography continue to hold their ground, and histories of Third World countries such as India remain Eurocentric in many respects. Appeals to the ancient and early medieval past are still often dictated by nationalist or communalist agendas. Marxist historiography continues to be an influential force in early Indian historiography. A few other aspects of the large volume of historical research of the last 50 years or so can be identified and cited here. New theoretical perspectives, scientific techniques, and a continuing growth in the volume of archaeological data have been transforming our understanding of the early Indian past, especially with regard to subsistence practices, technology, and human interaction with the environment. Paleo-environmental studies have directed attention to the changing ecology of the different regions and its impact on human life. These important issues are likely to increasingly engage the attention of scholars. Investigations of archival material have begun to reveal in unprecedented detail the complex stories of the people, institutions, and ideas involved in the construction of archaeological knowledge. Such studies also re-ECT the need to break the disciplinary divides between the ancient and the modern, and all that lies in between, by inquiring into issues such as the modern histories of ancient sites and monuments. The research of a small group of historians, mostly women, working on gender relations has radically altered the frontiers of early Indian social history. The focus on gender has involved much more than simply inserting women into history. Breaking away from the traditional position of women mold, it has asked new questions, broken the artificial divide between the private and political domains, and revealed the power hierarchies within the family and the household. The most important achievement of this line of research is that it has demonstrated the close relationship between gender and hierarchies based on class, caste, and political power. A significant feature of recent historiography of the early medieval period is the detailed study of the changing prole and configurations of regions and subregions. Based on careful empirical examination of epigraphic and textual sources, these studies have identified changes in political, economic, and social structures, with a special focus on agrarian relations and the legitimation of political power. In doing so, they have revealed the varied historical textures and trajectories in different parts of the Indian subcontinent in early medieval times. A critical understanding of historiography, one which recognizes the contributions and limitations of past and present ideological and theoretical frameworks, is essential in order to understand where the history of ancient and early medieval India stands today. However, the major advances of the future are likely to be the result of questioning and thinking beyond the boundaries of existing historiographical positions and methodologies. New histories, unwritten histories. History is not one but many stories, only a few of which have as yet been written. The challenges to build on the advances that have already been achieved so far are many. Currently, there are two parallel images of ancient South Asia, one based on literary sources, the other on archaeology. Texts and archaeology generate different sorts of historical narratives and suggest different rhythms of cultural continuity, transition, and change. Historians generally use archaeological evidence selectively as a corroborative source when it matches hypotheses based on their interpretation of texts. Archaeologists, for their part, have not adequately explored the historical implications of the available archaeological data. Correlations between literature and archaeology tend to be simplistic and devoid of careful reaction on methodology. We need to seriously consider whether, given their inherent differences, textual and archaeological evidence can be integrated, or whether we should simply aim at juxtaposition. The old tradition of extracting supposedly self-evident facts from literary sources needs to be replaced by an approach that is more sensitive to their genre, texture, and cadence. However, in view of the information and insights offered by rapidly growing archaeological data, historical narratives can no longer afford to remain text-centric. A more sophisticated approach towards textual study has to be accompanied by a proper incorporation of archaeological evidence. This will lead towards a more nuanced image of ancient India. It will reveal the complexities and diversities of cultural processes in the various regions, and will incorporate the ordinary and everyday into our understanding of the ancient past. Histories of early India should ideally represent the various regions and communities of the subcontinent in all their diversity. However, while the heartlands of great empires and kingdoms are well represented, many regions, for instance the Northeast, are not. Such regions have to be brought into the ambit of history. Bringing more people into history also requires further initiatives towards uncovering the past of groups who have been subordinated and marginalized for centuries, such as the laboring poor, lower castes, and tribal communities. This is not easy, given the fact that a great proportion of the source material available to historians has been created by elite groups and therefore reacts their ideas and interests. Nevertheless, the past of people who have been hidden from history has to be uncovered and written, and these histories must become an integral part of the narrative of the ancient Indian past. Explorations of gender, the family, and the household need to be pushed further and have to become part of larger social histories. Issues and institutions such as the family, class, varna, and jati need to be viewed from long-term perspectives, showing how the different bases of social identity intersected and changed over time. India's varied and complex cultural traditions are also in need of urgent attention. Interestingly, while these continue to be the focus of intensive research among scholars working in South Asian studies, religious studies, and art history departments abroad, they have in recent decades remained somewhat marginal to mainstream historical writing in India. Indian historians have often tended to treat religious cults and traditions primarily as ideologies reacting social and political power structures of the time. It must be recognized that the many different strands of religious thought and practice are an important aspect of history in their own right and need thorough investigation. This also applies to the history of ideas and the aesthetic dimensions of the Indian past reacted in literature, art, and architecture. Our understanding of the history of the subcontinent tends to be far too insular, and much greater attention needs to be paid to its relationships with other areas, especially East Asia and Southeast Asia. Apart from examining trade networks, there is a need to try to explore and understand the complexities of the cultural transactions between the different parts of Asia. These transactions are reacted not only in textual evidence, but also in a rich and exciting storehouse of material evidence in the form of inscriptions, sculpture, and architecture. There is a close relationship between history and identity. The past has, therefore, always been a contested terrain. In contemporary India, the ancient past is invoked in different ways in political discourse, including propaganda with chauvinistic or divisive agendas. There are debates over the state's right to project and propagate certain interpretations of the past through school textbooks. Communities frequently take offense at things written about them in historians' scholarly writings. In such a charged and intolerant atmosphere, there are several dangers of the deliberate manipulation and distortion of the past to achieve political ends, of historical hypotheses being judged on the basis of their political implications rather than their academic merit, and of historians being criticized for writing objective history. The need for deepening and enlarging a liberal academic space which nurtures level-headed dialogue and debate has perhaps never been greater. Aside from its role in current identity politics, ancient history is often considered distant, difficult to relate to, even irrelevant to our times and concerns. However, if we look carefully enough, we will in fact see that the roots of some of the social practices, institutions, and ideas of the present lie in the remote past. But even more interesting than the things that are familiar are those that are startlingly different. The most important thing that history can do is to teach us to think historically. It can make us realize that human experiences are diverse and complex, and it can make us aware of the many entangled threads of continuity and change that connect the present to the past. No less important is the fact that the story of the past contains much that is interesting and exciting. That in itself is enough justification for reading and writing history.